say might come to the second service. So, but we welcome you, those of you who came, and we hope that you come back right after second service for the congregational meeting. But before that, we have a meal in the back, potluck, so don't miss that. We're going to see a really quick video regarding Journey to Bethlehem, because right now during this season we're doing for Sunday school Journey to Bethlehem. Tim, would you put that up? So if you want to be part of that, you want your kids to be part of that, that is going to be during the Sunday school hour, right after the service downstairs. So don't miss that. We've been doing that every year. It's been a great time for both the teachers as well as the students. And I think even though the weather was bad last week, Sunday one we have 28 kids down there, so that's very good, and we want to continue that on. All right, congregational meeting then following second service, as I said. Then also, please, some of you kind of are crafty people. You like to make your own Christmas cards even in that. We need a craft person or two for Wednesday night Adventure Kids. Okay, we need a craft person. Now the crafts are all provided. You don't have to come up with any ideas, but we just need that crafty type person. Okay, so if you're interested, please see Courtney. She's standing right here in the back, or myself, and we'll get you in there. And we really need that desperately. So take note of that. And then also, Devin and Lexi, would you stand up? This is our first official Sunday, by the way. Give them a hand. I told Devin I was going to have you guys bow down before it, but he didn't want me to do that. So, all right. So then also keep alert on all the things going on in that bulletin, because next Sunday we have our Christmas program, and there's a lot of things in there that are just kind of like stuck in there in between the sentences, and you need to be aware of them. So please keep alert to all that. And at this time, if you stand and greet each other in the name of Christ.
first street or dared to break the wall, it doesn't take long to realize that the Christmas season can bring out the best and the absolute worst in people. Amidst all the holiday cheer, the season is fraught with conflict, wanting more than we have, spending more than we should, caring when it's convenient, and ultimately letting the light of the manger shine no brighter than a light displayed in front of our neighbor's house.
The prophet Isaiah writes, "A shoot will come up from the stump of Jesse. From his roots a branch will bear fruit. The Spirit of the Lord will rest on him, the Spirit of wisdom and understanding, the Spirit of counsel and might, the Spirit of knowledge and fear of the Lord. And he will delight in the fear of the Lord. He will not judge by what he sees with his eyes or decide by what he hears with his ears. But with righteousness he will judge the needy. With justice he will give decisions for the poor of the earth. He will strike the earth with the rod of his mouth, with the breath of his lips he will slay the wicked. Righteousness will be his belt, and faithfulness the sash around his waist. The wolf will live with the lamb, the leopard will lie down with the goat, the calf and the lion and the yearling together, and a little child will lead them. The cow will feed with the bear, their young will lie down together, and the lion will eat straw like the ox. The infant will play near the cobra's den, and the young child will put his hand into the viper's nest. They will neither harm nor destroy on all my holy mountain. For the earth will be filled with the knowledge of the Lord as the waters cover the sea. In that day, the root of Jesse will stand as a banner for the peoples. The nation will rally to him, and his resting place will be glorious."
Advent points us all to that day 2,000 years ago when the root of Jesse stood as a banner for the peoples. The nations will rally to him, and his resting place will be glorious. When the glory of the Lord shines, there is peace. Peace that breaks all conflict, even when it seems like it will last only moments. Yet, it's in the moments that, in spite of the conflict, we give glory and honor and praise, a peace that reigns.
We light these candles to say, in the midst of fear, we will hope. In the midst of conflict, there is peace.
Would you pray with me? Father, this Advent, we ask that you would use us to bring peace to the conflict, peace to our world, peace to our nation, peace to our state, peace to our city, peace to our families, and peace within each of us. As we light these candles, help us remember that 2,000 years ago, a child was born, and life as we know it was changed. Everything was changed. God of promise, God of hope, God of peace, into our darkness come. Amen.
You all can remain seated. doing that, you want to direct your attention to the flag.
giving God, we once again prepare for the birth of your chosen Son. You're the voice of the prophets and preachers. You have been heard in the driest deserts and the steepest valleys. Unfurl our hearts and open our minds that we may hear your salvation story anew. Giving this money is a worshipful gesture of our unending hallelujahs to you. We dedicate this offering to your kingdom work. Amen.
Lyle said when he came to the back there and saw me, he said, you know, there's going to see an amazing scene up in the choir. And I thought, Jim Wester joined the choir? I didn't know what I was looking for. But that choir loft was packed. Lyle, how many were in there today? Okay. Well, we had about every seat taken. So, congratulations and beautiful. Thank you, choir, for contributing with us today. And I should just say, this gal over here, Terry, you were in the hospital all week. Good to have you out. I saw her all week up there, and then she kept saying she's going to go home, she's going to go home, going to go home, and the nurse kept looking at me, shaking her head, no. So, it's good to have you back, Terry. So, a lot of people didn't realize she's in the hospital pretty much the week. Bob Crone is going to have to go back in about 30 days, and he's going to have some procedures done to get that stone taken care of that's in his bile duct. And then Gary Christian said he starts chemo here real soon. Keep him in your prayers if you would. Don Hype, he's got to go back and have some procedures done to his heart, and we keep him in our prayers as well. And Joyce Van Lowe, I don't know what to say about Joyce. I go over every Monday to Teason's over in Marion and try to spend a little time with Joyce and Verl. And, you know, she's supposed to have that brain tumor. And it's supposed to have done something by now, but she has basically held her own. She's in great spirits, and she's able to sit up somewhat during the day and talk. And I know she sleeps a lot more than she used to, but she's still with us. And I said, Joyce, do you have any pain? No. I said, are you enjoying the season? And she said, yes. So she's with her family, and we'll see her probably again tomorrow, and I'll give her best wishes to all of you. But what an amazing thing. And we just keep her in our prayers that she can experience the wonder of Christmas. Let's look to the Lord in prayer. Lord God, we do give you thanks for your goodness and for your love. We give you thanks because you decided before the foundation of the world that you would come into this little scene in Bethlehem and you would transform this entire world because of our sin. And Lord, that verse, out of that stump of Jesse, a shoot shall appear. And though we saw that stump and it was dead, and it seemed rotting, it seemed like there could be no life within it, in your miraculous way, you sent the shoot out of that, which is Jesus Christ. Come into this world to give us a hope and a purpose and a peace that we cannot find any other way. You are the reason for this season. And you're the reason why we are gathered here this day, and we worship you. Behold, I bring to you good news of a great joy. Born for you this day in the city of David, a Savior, Christ the Lord. Amen.
Thank you, Stephen. How many of y'all, when the choir was going, they were singing, they were doing the melody, and then when they got to the fall on your knees part, you went, what? I was back there and was like, oh, that's my favorite part in that song. Well done, choir, well done. It wouldn't be a bad thing if there's a few of you that went, oh, I could do that too. We can sneak a few more people in there. I think Dick Van Hollen was the only one I saw that was back in the corner like this. I looked over there and thought, oh, that kind of looks uncomfortable. But I mean, as soon as you stand up, muscle away, push everybody out. If you're visiting with us, thank you for coming. This Advent season, we are doing something a little different. We are, typically you would hear the story on a real close-up level of Mary and Jesus, and
Children in worship can go down.
children in worship can go that way. If there's, sorry,
Sorry, you're getting there.
I forgot about that too. So children in worship go that way for, no, the Bethlehem thing is in between. Sorry, this is one of those. This is the time of year where my brain goes, you know when your computer has that spinning wheel and you're like, no, don't do that. Like there's mornings here where I'm like, huh? So we are taking a step back. And so rather than looking at the small scale of Mary and Joseph and the manger and the baby Jesus, we're stepping back and looking from a larger scene, looking from a cosmic standpoint, from a worldview that is all-encompassing. And you would have heard earlier in the candle reading and stuff, the shoot of Jesse, and Steve and I were like, man, that's just one of our favorite imageries of this dead, lifeless stump brings forth something that changes everything. And in O Come, O Come Emmanuel, I had to dig out the old verse. It's like verse 7 that's not in any hymnal anymore. Thy rod of Jesse free us from Satan's tyranny. That today we're looking, as we're going to continue looking in the book of Revelation in chapter 12. You can feel free to turn there. We're going to look at the first section of that chapter. And I'll touch on a little bit of last week's and the story of the woman clothed with the sun and the moon and the stars. And then today we're going to talk about the dragon. And so for those of you that think that this is all weird, it is kind of weird. But let me just preface and say that when John's writing these things, you have to remember that he's writing somewhere in the mid-90s AD to a people that are suffering persecution, and not like grand scale persecution anymore. By the 90s it had kind of dissipated a bit, but it still wasn't okay. It wasn't okay to walk around and be a Christian, and there were times where you couldn't even go to the marketplace and buy things unless you offered incense to the emperor. And so you see all of this imagery, and what John is really doing here is just like Jesus would stand in front of the Jewish people and tell parables, stories that weren't necessarily real, but ways for them to see it in a different way. John does that with a little more flowery language that you really would have to read through the book of Daniel, especially chapter 7 and 8, to grasp some of the things that he's talking about. I'm going to pray, and then we're going to jump in. So I invite you to, while I'm praying, simply ask God to help you understand things and help me not to speak gibberish, so that when it goes in your ear, it actually stays in and it doesn't just go out the other one, and then you leave here and go, well, that wasn't very Christmassy. Because I hope it is. That's our intent. So I invite you to pray with me. Spirit, I pray for some calm. I pray for some reassurance. I pray for your revelation. I pray for you to unfold the things that we need to know and hear. I pray that these wild and flowery language, these scenes that seem so confusing to us, wouldn't be when we begin to look at it a little closer. I pray that you would give us the ability to understand that is maybe even a bit supernatural beyond the things that we can. And I pray here this day that you would speak, that your voice would reign, that your words would penetrate deep, and that we would leave changed people. Father, like that fateful day that you spoke life into dirt, and Adam was, speak life into us. In Jesus' name, amen. Now, before we jump into Revelation, what I want to do is I'm going to tell you a few things. Think of it as puzzle pieces, or a bit of a prologue, if you will. Instead of just telling you a story, I'm going to tell you like snapshots. So you know when you go to watch a movie and suddenly it shows you like one scene, and then it goes to another scene, and it goes to another scene, and you go, that don't make sense. But in the end, you go, oh. You got to put those glasses on right now, or those headphones on, because you're going to hear it rather than see it. And the first thing I want you to see is a sweet, light blue, 1986 Plymouth Caravelle, 4-door. Does anybody know that car? One person does. The Dodge Reliant. Some of you are a little more familiar. The New Yorker. Did you know the New Yorker? Yeah, I knew you would know the fancier one. This is the step below. This is like the economy class, light blue. Right there it is. I want you to hear the sound of sticky paint under your shoes. Almost like when you walk through the snow out there and you come back inside. Not the squeak, but the where your shoes kind of stick to it. I want you to remember back to the mid-90s. It's a gateway computer, because we all had one then. And it's the snake game, where you use the arrows, and you eat the apples, and it moves around like this, but you can't eat yourself. Like, it just gets longer and longer and longer, and around and around and around until, and then you start over again. I want you to see a brand new, fresh, white winter coat. And then maybe the scene of a quaint little farmhouse on the corner of a section. The trees are just like a few mornings ago, where the frost and the fog has set in, and they're white and crystal-like and beautiful. The snow on the ground is more like salt crystal, so when you step on them, they crunch. A large chest deep freeze on its side. And a quaint smell in the air. You know, when you go outside in the wintertime and it's crisp, but it almost feels nice, and it's just a little refreshing. An old, trusty rifle, 410 shotgun with a little bit of rust on it, but reliable. And the windows bearing just a hint of condensation and frost where you can't quite see. I would invite you now, Revelation chapter 12. Tim will have them on the screen, but feel free to have your Bible in front of you. It will help to just have it there, because I'm not going to have him flip through a whole bunch of things. I'm going to go through and read it, and then we're going to kind of dissect some things. So for those of you that like the stories, we'll get back to the stories. For those of you that go, can you give me that old school Bible teacher talk, that expositional, like me and Steve always joke, the guy from Aberdeen with the really big nose on TV that you see? Yeah. Some of you are like, oh yeah, I know that guy. He's good. And I listen to him and go, wonder how, never mind. I think about how big his nose is. Like, was it always that big, or did it get smaller? And then I go, people watch us on YouTube. I wonder what they think about us. And there's quite a few. So I'm going to jump in right at the beginning of Revelation here. I'm going to read the whole passage, just through the first 9 verses, and then we're going to dissect some things. So, right away, John says, you have to keep in mind, this is the middle of the book of Revelation. And Revelation, really, the word is apocalypse. And what apocalypse means is, think like tearing the paper off of a present. Not like, ooh, scary, oh no, end times, weird things are happening. But literally, it means revealing or unfolding or turning the page to discover what comes next. This is John's revelation to you. His apocalypse of literally the apo is to take off and to peer in. To open and see, like on Christmas Eve, where you tear the presents open just to see what's inside. Same thought process here. We get to the middle, and this is the turning point in the book, and we find a great sign, not something magical, but a sign. He says, I saw something. A sign appeared in heaven. A woman clothed with the sun, with the moon under her feet, and a crown of 12 stars on her head. She was pregnant and cried out in pain as she was about to give birth. Then another sign appeared in heaven. An enormous red dragon with 7 heads, 10 horns, and 7 crowns on its heads. Its tail swept away a third of the stars out of the sky and flung them to the earth. And the dragon stood in front of the woman who was about to give birth, so that it might devour her child the moment it was born. She gave birth to a son, a male child, who will rule the nations with an iron scepter. And her child was snatched up to God and to his throne. Then the woman fled into the wilderness to a place prepared for her by God, where she might be taken care of for 1,260 days. Then war broke out in heaven. Michael and his angels fought against the dragon, and the dragon and his angels fought back. But he was not strong enough, and they lost their place in heaven. The great dragon was hurled down, that ancient serpent called the devil or Satan, who leads the whole world astray. He was hurled to the earth, and his angels with him. Now, within this, you have to keep in mind that we are looking from a cosmic perspective. Without a doubt, you read this story and you look at this, and this is the Christmas story, but not on a small scale. So here we see a woman giving birth to a son, someone that will change things, rule with an iron scepter. We'll talk about that next week, Psalm 2. But within that, you have to keep in mind that John takes an image through which he lived through. You have to remember that Jesus on the cross told John, John, your mother is right there. Take care of her. To Mary. He knew her intimately. They were family at that point. That he takes the biblical imagery of a woman with a child waiting to give birth, with struggles of pain and longing expectation of the hope that is to come, and says, let's take that and blow it up on a grander scale. So imagine, if you will, this is much like the communion scene where we see it's just bread and it's just juice or wine, but suddenly it means something so much more with intentionality. So with that in your head, you have to remember that Mary is in mind, but not the focus. So it might be a sign of what's going on, but not the focus. And in order to really understand, you have to take your proverbial glasses off, put them on, and begin to read it like John would have wrote it in the end of the first century. And the way he would have wrote it is by thinking things that he learned as a boy through Old Testament scripture. So we're going to turn, if you will, to, you don't have to go there, it'll be up on the screen. We're going to look at Genesis 37. This is Joseph. Joseph and one of his dreams. Then he, Joseph, had another dream, and he told it to his brothers. Listen, he said, I had another dream. And this time, the sun and the moon and 11 stars were bowing down to me. Then he went and told his father as well as his brothers, and his father rebuked him and said, what is this dream you had? Will your mother and I and your brothers actually bow down to the ground before you? Now let's just pause there. You can go back one, Tim. You just heard from the Revelation passage that a woman clothed with the sun and the moon and the stars, right? And you go, where the heck does that come from? Well, the first place it comes up is when Joseph says to his family, I had a dream of a man in the sun, the moon, and stars all bowing down to me. And then you see the own interpretation of what that is by his father. This is Israel. God gives him the name Israel, and he says, I and your mother are going to bow down to you with your brothers? So when John sees this and he applies it to the image of the woman, which we'll get to a little thoroughly, you have to read it with the lens of Israel and the 12 tribes as the stars, that there is something, think big picture, not little, big picture, worldwide cosmic reality. Now I'm going to go to Isaiah 26. As a pregnant woman about to give birth writhes and cries out in her pain, so were we in your presence, Lord. We were with child, we writhed in labor, but we gave birth to wind. We have not brought salvation to the earth, and the people of the world have not come to life. Now here you see the prophet Isaiah speaking within the context of those being taken off into exile. And so Jerusalem is at siege, Isaiah is here, and he uses the imagery of the people of Israel as a pregnant woman. A pregnant woman crying out in labor pain because it hurts, and then she gives birth to nothing. No salvation. And there's multiple others, but if you take those two right and left lens of Joseph's dream, Isaiah's usage of Israel as a woman crying out in labor pains in hopeful expectation of something to come, we'll read that beginning section of Revelation again. Then a great sign appeared in heaven, a woman clothed with the sun, with the moon under her feet, and a crown of 12 stars on her head. You should hear the echoes of Genesis 37, of Joseph's dream of Israel crying out in pain. She was pregnant, and she cried out in pain as she was about to give birth. This, my friends, is the Christmas story on a cosmic scale. Big. For all of the world. That the nation of Israel, pregnant with expectation, longing for someone to come and change things, waiting for that moment. Now, I should say that last week, Steve ran and followed more of the Mary line, and that your life can bring that hope. But the thing that often we miss out on throughout Christmas is that it was painful. And that over and over again in these passages, you find that Israel, the woman, the nation, struggling, like each and every one of us can struggle at times, and that pain brings forth hope. That through that struggle of birth, something comes in the end. And where we saw in Isaiah, there was nothing but wind. Here, John says, no longer does the nation give birth to nothing, but it gives birth to the Son that will change everything. And now before we move into the dragon passages, we're going to step back a second again. So that was for all of you, that was your recap of last week, wanting some little more biblical kind of nuts and bolts and pieces to help read this. Now we're going to go back to Genesis again, all the way back, Genesis 3. And here is the backdrop, the lens that you have to put on in order to read the next section. Now the serpent was more crafty than any of the wild animals that the Lord had made. And he said to the woman, "Did God really say?" And you know the story that happens. And then we get to verse 14. So the Lord said to the serpent, "Because you have done this, cursed are you above all livestock and wild animals. You will crawl on your belly, and you will eat dust all the days of your life. And I will put enmity between you and the woman, between your offspring and hers, and he will crush your head, and you will strike his heel." This is the cosmic battle of all of the world and all of the nations and of all time. Prequel. At the very beginning, he says, you will get your head crushed. And you will try to do something about it, but it still won't work. That from the beginning, we see this This is like when you see so many now, like they make a movie and then they go back and they make another movie before it to let you know like what happened. Like the one that comes to mind is the Lord of the Rings movies. And then they're like, oh, that made us a bunch of money. We should do the Hobbit movies and we'll go backwards and start over from the beginning. This is what's happening. John, with this in mind, beginning at the foundations, there is a struggle. There is a tension. Okay. Are y'all following with me before I keep on moving on? I'm getting some head nods. It feels like it's okay. Now we're going to move a little bit forward. Past the prequel, we're going to jump into Jeremiah. This is Jeremiah 51. And the context here is Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, is taking control of the people in the exile of the lower areas of Jerusalem. Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, has devoured us. He has thrown us into confusion and he has made us an empty jar. Like a serpent, he has swallowed us and filled his stomach with our delicacies and then has spewed us out. Over and over again, I just picked this one verse. There's multiple times throughout the prophetic literature of Isaiah and Jeremiah and even in the Psalms where it talks about the ancient beasts, the Leviathan, the beast of Egypt, the beast of Persia. There's multiple scenes that we see throughout here. Even in the book of Daniel, it talks explicitly about a number of these things. But the point here is that something is signified by it. Here we see Nebuchadnezzar has swallowed them. Did he physically swallow anybody? No. It's an image to tell you that that nation, that king, took us. The people were literally taken into captivity, paraded around, and thrown out into camps. This is where you'll see things with Jeremiah and Isaiah and Ezekiel digging through the side of his hut and all of those things. But the point is that we begin to see that John lived in a context where it was common for them to use big, scary figures as big, scary things that were average and ordinary in their day. Nation after nation after nation, empire after empire comes up, and they use these words so that people can see it was scary on a proportion that we just can't explain. So now let's look at that Revelation passage one more time, the next part. Then another sign appeared in heaven, an enormous red dragon with 7 heads and 10 horns and 7 crowns upon its heads. And its tail swept away 1/3 of the stars from the sky and flung them to the earth. And the dragon stood in front of the woman who was about to give birth so that it might devour her child the moment it was born. Jumping to verse 7, we get John's own interpretation here of what this is, telling us what we should know. Then a war broke out in heaven. Michael and his angels fought against the dragon, and the dragon and his angels fought back. But he was not strong enough, and they lost their place in heaven. The dragon was hurled down, that ancient serpent. Think Genesis 3, the one called the devil or Satan, who leads the whole world astray, was hurled to the earth and his angels with him. Here John tells us the dragon is not just some small ruler like Nebuchadnezzar or just Rome or some place in time, but he says this is the one whom all evil resides. This is the one that the Christ child comes forth to do battle against. The one who will stomp his head. Scared you a little bit because this is big. This isn't Jesus, this manger, fictitious. Jesus' manger was probably a chiseled piece of stone that had leftover bits of food in it. Literally a rock with a hole in it that animals would come and eat in. Inside of a house. That sometimes we get so fixated on the little things of the story that we forget that at that time something happened. It's like you stand at the pool and the fat guy does the cannonball and all the water flows around. It's kind of a joke, but it's like a ripple in the pond of life, that all of the world was changed at that moment. Here we see a big, scary picture. We see a dragon with 7 heads and 10 horns and 7 crowns, and really all of that stuff is just John likes the number 7. There's no fancy imagery in that other than its completeness. His power was powerful. You can see a bunch of the imagery stuff comes in, if you're taking notes, Daniel 7. He has this vision that eventually becomes nations, and the horns meant power. That here before him in the sky, he sees a woman crying out in pain, waiting to give birth to the one that will save them. And the ancient serpent of old, the adversary, the accuser, the slanderer, the liar, the one that holds everything at bay, waiting to snatch it up at the last moment. You should also hear King Herod. The Magi come and they say, "Where is the King of the Jews? We want to worship him." And he says, "Yes, tell me about this King of the Jews. I want to worship him too." Herod, just like all of the other nations and kings under the rule of the evil one, tries to step in and intervene, to snatch him away before his power can be realized. Talks about the tail sweeping away 1/3 of the stars, and here the reality is you can find in Daniel 8, where he talks about one of the beasts pulling stars from the heaven and throwing them to the ground on the earth, is literally just saying his power was extreme. This is the cosmic forces of good and evil, of God in the great battlefront, with the deep, red, fiery dragon of all deceit and lies, proving that he has power. You could read maybe a little bit of, maybe there's some angels that followed him as the stars in the sky, but it doesn't say that explicitly. The point of this whole scene is that you see the nation of Israel longing for something more, just like we do today. Longing for something to bring hope and light into our darkness, and right there waiting. As scary as can be is the cosmic battle of good and evil, of God versus this ancient serpent. And before you get scared, he gives us the picture. There's one sign that's in the heavens, which literally means the skies, because he sweeps the stars away. And then there's the other sign of in the heavens, the place where God dwells, was a cosmic battle between Michael and the angels and the serpent and his angels, and he lost. The child was not eaten. He was not taken. We'll get into more of that next week. What I want to do now is come back and put your pieces to the puzzle back together. The quaint farmhouse was my house in freshman year of high school. And I remember sitting at the computer table playing the snake game, eating the apples as it went around, sitting in the computer chair. My dad came up and rubbed my shoulders and just goes, "Hello, buddy. I just want you to know that." I said, "Yeah, okay, yeah." You know, like every high school kid does. Uh-huh. The white coat was my brand new Christmas present for going snowboarding. Because during those days, like, snowboarding was really on my high priority list, out in the middle of the plains of northwest Iowa. I look back at it and go, "Really? All right, well, all right." The paint was on the steps headed out of the house, and I can still remember as my shoes stuck to it, because it was that weird spot between being too cold to hold humidity outside, but it was right off the kitchen, and so there was just enough humidity in the air to make the ground kind of sticky. Screen door is open, And the ground is covered in snow, that hard rock crystal snow, where it was so cold that it literally didn't fall pretty like beautiful flakes, but it just thudded to the ground, and when you stepped, it crunched. Trees were the white scene that we had a few days ago. And the Plymouth Caravel sat just in the distance. As I approached the car, because my mom said, "I think your dad's car is stuck." Walked up to the car, and the windows were frosted over with just enough condensation that you couldn't see in. Inside was my dad, the trusty old 410 shotgun. The chest freezer was a part of my afterward rampage of throwing a 8-foot-long chest freezer across my garage, and I was just a little boy then. I remember running inside to the old AT&T business telephone with all the different numbers and dials, and trying to do 911 and yelling at my mom to do it. All of that to say is that there is an evil one that longs to steal your peace this holiday season. He longs to do anything and everything he can to take the power of Christmas away from you. Lurking, waiting. To his end, he would use darkness and evil and slander and lies. He longs for your pain to give birth to despair and not hope. Maybe it's even more subtle, where it's not your heartache or your anxieties, but simply the reality of how much stuff should you buy. If he could just get a few more of us to live in a world of complete consumerism, buying more presents for under the tree, that would distract him just enough. Or maybe for us in here that live in the religious world of, maybe they didn't sing the song the way you liked it. Maybe the kids' program wasn't quite the old pageant style that you wished it was. Maybe you missed the verse in that song that they really should have sang. Maybe this sermon series just isn't the one that you really wanted, because it's not little baby Jesus in a manger, and the wise men and the shepherds. That's what happens when we become religious. He will even use the things that we love against us to tell us that wasn't good enough. He will do anything. And yet, it's not that last piercing darkness of the eyes of the dragon or the fiery red hate that it symbolizes. It's not the expansive darkness of utter despair. There's still more. There's something else left. That for those walking in darkness, they have seen a great light. And on those living in the land of deep darkness, a light has dawned. For to us a child is born, to us a son is given. And the government will be on his shoulders, and he will be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, and Prince of Peace. And of his greatness and his government and peace there will be no end. He will reign on David's throne and over his kingdom, and establishing and upholding it with justice and righteousness from that time and forever. I invite you to stand and sing with us as we close. before John sees the big scary vision in the sky, he's given a glimpse of the throne room of heaven, into the holiest part, the place that gives him strength to not fear the things coming. For then I looked, and I heard the voice of many angels, numbering thousands upon thousands, and 10,000 times 10,000. And they encircled the throne of the living creatures and the elders, and with a loud voice they sang, "Worthy is the Lamb who was slain, to receive power and wealth and wisdom and strength and honor and glory